The Silent Bond. In the quiet, secluded town of Green Ridge, the hustle and bustle of the outside world felt like a distant memory. The town, home to just over 1,500 people, was nestled in the foothills of the Appalachians, where the fog rolled over the mountains each morning and the townspeople went about their days in a slow, deliberate manner. Green Ridge had always been a place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and the Turners, a family of old money and tradition, were no exception. Emily Turner had spent most of her childhood in this small, tight-knit community, but over the years, the charm of the town had worn thin for her. As a child, she had been the odd one out, constantly feeling as though she didn't quite fit into her family's world of high expectations and social status. Her father, Robert Turner, a successful business tycoon who owned a number of real estate properties, had long since expected perfection from his children, especially Emily. Robert had always had grand plans for her, expectations she could never quite meet. Her mother, Susan, a well-groomed, perfectionistic woman who ran the local charity circuit, always seemed to have a smile on her face, but her words were laced with criticism. "Why can't you be more like Ben?" she would say, referring to Emily's younger brother. Ben was everything Robert and Susan had hoped for: successful, confident, and well-liked. He had followed in their footsteps and worked his way up through the family business. Emily, on the other hand, had always struggled with her identity. After graduating college with a degree in literature, she had jumped from one dead-end job to another. Her parents never understood why she couldn't find a real job, one that would give her the stability and status they believed she deserved. Every year, it felt like the weight of their expectations grew heavier, until Emily found herself withdrawing further from them. The endless dinners where her accomplishments, or lack thereof, were discussed in hushed, disapproving tones became unbearable. In the last few years, Emily had left Green Ridge in search of a life that was different from the one her parents had envisioned for her. She had moved to the city, worked in a small bookstore, and had a brief relationship with a man who eventually moved on. After he left, she found herself back in Green Ridge, with no job and no place else to go. When she arrived back home, her parents welcomed her with open arms, but it was not the kind of welcome she had hoped for. There was always an underlying tension, a sense of disappointment in their eyes. "We've given you so many opportunities, Emily," her mother had said on the first evening back, her voice dripping with passive-aggressive sweetness. "Perhaps this time you'll find your way." Emily, feeling like she had no choice, moved into the small guest room upstairs in the Turner home. It was a space she had occupied as a child, but it now felt like a prison. It was an odd place to be in, both familiar and stifling. Every day, her parents would remind her of the importance of financial independence, of not relying on others. But at the same time, they were offering her nothing. They never once asked her how she felt about the situation, nor did they try to understand the weight of her insecurities and failures. For months, she tried to find work, but the market was unforgiving. Each job she applied to turned her away. "Not the right fit," they would say, or "we've decided to go in another direction." The frustration built up slowly. Her parents, however, were unsympathetic. They insisted that the problem lay with her, that she wasn't trying hard enough, and that she should be grateful for the roof over her head. And then there was David. David was different. He had his own set of issues, his own brokenness that somehow made him relatable to Emily. They had met years earlier, at a friend's party in a city far from Green Ridge. David was wild-eyed and troubled, his anxiety palpable in every word he spoke. At first, Emily had tried to distance herself from him. She was always cautious with people who had as much baggage as David seemed to, but something about him drew her in. His vulnerability mirrored her own, and soon, they found themselves inseparable. David was like a reflection of her soul, unfiltered, raw, and angry at the world for the hand they'd been dealt. Unlike her parents, David never judged her for her failures. He never tried to fix her or make her feel less than. Instead, he saw her as someone worthy of love and acceptance, flaws and all. They had struggled together financially for years, moving from place to place, never really finding a stable home. They lived in a rundown apartment for a while, then a shabby rented house. But when things got tough, they always had each other. When David's anxiety spiraled out of control, Emily was there. When she felt like a failure, David reminded her that they were in this together. David had moved to Green Ridge with her after she had lost her job in the city. It was his idea. They had nothing left but each other, and he couldn't bear the thought of her being alone in the town. They moved into the small mobile home on her parents' property, tucked away in the back corner of the large estate. At first, her parents had been hesitant, but they allowed it with the stipulation that Emily and David would contribute to the household in some way. David didn't have a job, and neither did Emily, so her parents gave them a gift of space to live in. But they made it clear that their continued presence on the property was conditional. They told Emily that if she didn't pay rent, they would have to ask her to leave. This was the beginning of the strain. Emily and David both felt trapped in a situation where they were reliant on her parents, and the weight of that reliance crushed them both. It was as if they were being suffocated by their own inability to break free from her family's control. The silent bond between Emily and David grew stronger as their frustration with her parents deepened. Neither of them knew how to escape the grip of Green Ridge or the grip of Robert and Susan Turner. But as the days turned into weeks and the weeks into months, the resentment and the anger began to fester. For Emily, the bond with David had become the only thing that felt real. Together, they spent sleepless nights planning their future, dreaming of escape, of freedom, and of a life where they could live without the shadow of her parents' expectations looming over them. They became consumed by the idea of vengeance, of retribution for all the years they had spent living in their parents' shadow. As Christmas approached, the tension within the Turner household reached a boiling point. Emily's resentment toward her parents and her parents' increasing demands for rent filled her with a sense of desperation. She was at her breaking point. The promises she had made to herself, to finally take control, to gain respect, seemed more distant than ever. Yet, as Christmas Eve drew near, a dark and dangerous plan began to take root in her mind. The vow she had made to herself was about to become something far more tangible and far more deadly. And so, the stage was set. Emily and David were ready to make a decision that would change their lives and the lives of her family. Forever. The bond they shared was about to lead them down a path they could never return from. The breaking point. The winter chill of Green Ridge was unlike any other. The biting cold winds swept through the narrow streets and tree-lined hills, a constant reminder of the town's isolation. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone's name, yet no one knew anyone's true heart. For Emily, this feeling of isolation had taken root long ago, but it had never been as suffocating as it was now. Each day she spent in the house with her parents felt like she was slowly being swallowed by the very people who should have offered her sanctuary. David, too, had begun to feel the pressure. He had never been one to hide his emotions, but even he struggled to articulate the growing tension between them and her parents. He had always seen Emily as a fragile, beautiful soul, but as time passed, it became clear to him that their situation was reaching its boiling point. His anxiety had worsened, and he was finding it harder and harder to keep his thoughts from spiraling. He felt as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders, and Emily's struggle to meet her parents' expectations only exacerbated the situation. The house, once warm and inviting, now felt like a prison. Robert and Susan, always the picture of control and discipline, were constantly on Emily's case. "Why don't you get yourself together, Emily?" her father would ask with a tone of quiet disdain. "You've had plenty of chances. Don't waste them. You could be doing better than this." It was the same conversation every time they spoke, and each time the words cut deeper. Her mother, Susan, was just as insistent, though more passive-aggressive in her approach. "It's just that simple, you know," she'd say, putting her hand on Emily's arm with feigned sympathy. "Just get a job. You've got the skills. You just have to apply yourself." There was no recognition of the mental toll the constant failure had on Emily. No acknowledgement of the endless rejections that haunted her every day. Susan's words were a reminder that Emily had never lived up to the ideal of perfection her parents held so dearly. It was the same story every day. Wake up, apply for jobs, fail to land interviews, and listen to her parents' criticisms. The days blurred into one another. There was no escape, no reprieve from the ever-present weight of judgment. Emily couldn't remember the last time she had felt like herself. It was as if her identity had been slowly eroding, replaced by the unrelenting expectations of others. David, for his part, was becoming increasingly agitated. His anxiety was spiraling out of control. He could no longer keep the inner turmoil inside. Each time he overheard Emily's parents giving her the same speech, his anger bubbled over. It wasn't just about their treatment of Emily. It was about their treatment of him, too. He had never been fully accepted by Emily's family. They saw him as nothing more than a broken man, a failure, just like Emily. His desperation for approval had turned into resentment. He was tired of being judged for his past mistakes, tired of being treated like a burden. One evening, after yet another argument between Emily and her parents about paying rent for the mobile home, the couple retreated to their small living room, a dingy space barely big enough for the two of them. David stood at the window, his back to Emily, staring out into the darkness of the yard. He was silent, his breathing shallow and uneven. Emily sat on the worn-out couch, her fingers running over the fabric nervously. The tension between them was palpable, and the silence stretched on longer than either of them could bear. Finally, David spoke. "I can't keep doing this," he said quietly, his voice low and tense. He turned to face Emily, his eyes burning with frustration. "I can't keep living like this, in this house, under their thumb. We're not going anywhere as long as we're here." Emily's heart raced as she met his gaze. She knew what he meant. She had felt it too, the suffocating weight of being trapped in a life that wasn't her own. The expectations of her parents, the constant pressure to succeed, the fear of disappointing everyone around her. It was all too much. But David's words were a wake-up call, a final admission that the breaking point had arrived. "Maybe we don't have a choice," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "Maybe this is just who we are now. Failures." David's eyes darkened. "No," he snapped. "We don't have to be. We can change this. We can take control." His words hung in the air, charged with a dangerous energy. Emily could feel the weight of his anger, but there was something else beneath it, something deeper, darker. For the first time, she saw the raw intensity of David's emotions, the dark thoughts that had been festering inside him for months, maybe longer. Emily swallowed hard. She knew David's anger wasn't just about her parents anymore. It was about everything. The years of frustration, the endless disappointments, the feeling of being trapped in a life they never chose. And as she looked at him, she realized that she felt the same way. She was tired of being small, tired of being ignored, tired of living in the shadows of others. David took a step closer to her. "We're not failures, Emily. We just haven't taken control yet. We haven't made the world respect us. But we can. We can take it all back." His voice was low and threatening now, filled with an intensity that sent a shiver down Emily's spine. Emily's heart raced. A part of her wanted to pull away, to run from the darkness in his words. But another part of her, the part that had been crushed under the weight of her parents' expectations for so long, felt a dark pull toward David's anger. The idea of taking control, of seizing power in a way that no one could take from them, was intoxicating. It was a dangerous thought, but it was also the only thing that made her feel alive. She looked up at him, her voice shaking but resolute. "What do you mean? What are you saying, David?" David's eyes gleamed with something wild, something dangerous. "I mean, we take what we deserve. We take everything from them. All the respect, all the power. We take it back, Emily. And we don't let anyone tell us what we can and can't do." For a long moment, Emily stood frozen, staring at David. His words sank into her, settling deep into the core of her being. She had been angry for so long, but she had never thought about how far she was willing to go to make things right. The idea of destroying everything that had ever held her back was both terrifying and liberating. David stepped forward, closing the distance between them. "We're going to end this," he said softly, almost lovingly. "We're going to take control of our lives, and no one will ever look down on us again." The words hung in the air, heavy with promise and threat. Emily's heart pounded in her chest as she realized the magnitude of what David was suggesting. This wasn't just about getting respect from her parents. This was something darker, something more dangerous than she had ever imagined. But as she looked into David's eyes, she knew that the path they were about to take would change everything. And there would be no turning back. The Christmas Eve arrival expanded. The night was unusually quiet in Green Ridge on Christmas Eve. The usual bustle of holiday preparations, children running excitedly through the streets, lights twinkling on every porch, the smell of homemade pies filling the air, was absent. Instead, the cold night held an eerie stillness, as if the town itself was holding its breath. Emily Turner couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, as if everything she had done, everything she had planned, had led to this moment. The weight of her decisions hung over her like an oppressive cloud, and she felt a sick anticipation deep in her stomach. David, beside her, was eerily calm. The initial fury that had fueled their conversation in the previous days had simmered down into something quieter, more determined. Emily could feel his cold focus as they prepared for what was to come. She had never seen him like this before. Composed, controlled, yet radiating a quiet violence that sent a shiver down her spine. The intense bond between them, forged in the fires of their shared misery and frustration, had become something darker, something she was no longer sure she could control. They had planned this night for weeks, maybe longer. David had insisted on arming themselves, convinced that it was the only way they would ever gain control of their lives. And now, as they sat in the truck in front of the Turner estate, the plan was about to unfold. Emily's parents, Robert and Susan, had invited her and David over for Christmas dinner, a tradition that, in previous years, had been an exercise in forced politeness. But this year was different. This year, Emily had made a vow to herself that if her parents didn't start treating her with the respect she deserved, she would make them pay. They had crossed a line when they demanded rent from her for the mobile home on their property. It was the final straw. David, who had never been fully accepted by her family, had shared in her anger. But his reasons went beyond just her parents' treatment of him. The years of living in their shadow, the constant judgment, the unspoken disdain, he could no longer stand it. Emily's parents had always treated him as an outsider, a failure, someone who didn't belong in their perfect world. And now, they were forcing Emily into a corner, making her choose between living in their world or finding her own path. They made it clear that she was nothing but a burden, and the way they made her feel, the way they treated her, had built up over the years into something far more dangerous than either of them could have anticipated. As they approached the house, the Christmas lights twinkled in the distance, casting long shadows across the snow-covered driveway. Emily's breath caught in her throat as they drove past the familiar gate, now locked and barricaded. The house looked warm from the outside, its windows glowing with the light of the Christmas tree inside. But to Emily, it felt more like a prison than a home. She felt her hands tremble in her lap, but she forced herself to breathe. She couldn't back down now, not after everything they had planned. David pulled the truck to a stop just outside the front gate. He turned off the engine, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hiss of the wind against the truck. Emily looked out the window, her eyes scanning the dark windows of her parents' home. The world outside was still and silent, but inside, her family was preparing for dinner, unaware of the nightmare that was about to unfold. "Are you ready?" David asked, his voice low and steady. Emily nodded, though her heart was pounding in her chest. There was a moment of hesitation, a fleeting second of doubt, but it passed quickly. She had made a decision, and nothing could stop her now. She grabbed the small handgun from the seat beside her, feeling its cold weight in her hand. The thought of what they were about to do twisted her stomach into knots, but she couldn't back out. The anger, the resentment, the years of feeling invisible and unloved, they had all built up to this. David looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. "We do this quickly. No turning back." With that, they both stepped out of the truck, the crunch of the snow beneath their boots the only sound breaking the silence. They moved quickly, staying low to the ground, careful not to be seen. They approached the back of the house, where the kitchen door was slightly ajar, as it always was when her mother was preparing for company. Emily's heart raced in her chest as she pushed the door open. Inside, her mother was busy at the stove, humming softly to herself as she prepared the Christmas dinner. Robert was in the living room, seated by the fire, sipping a glass of wine. The house seemed almost too perfect, too idyllic. It was everything Emily had never felt it was. A place of safety, comfort, and love. But to her, it had always been a place of disappointment, of judgment. And now, the time had come to take it all away. David moved silently behind her, a dark shadow in the kitchen. Emily's hand was shaking as she pulled the gun from her coat pocket. She hesitated for a fraction of a second before stepping into the kitchen, her eyes locking onto her mother, who turned in surprise. "Emily, what?" Susan's voice caught in her throat, but she didn't have a chance to finish her sentence. Emily raised the gun, her heart hammering in her chest. She pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening in the small kitchen. Her mother's body crumpled to the floor, the once perfect image of Christmas cheer shattered in an instant. Emily's breath came in ragged gasps as she looked down into the lifeless body of the woman who had always expected perfection from her. But there was no time to think. David was already moving, his eyes wild with adrenaline. He grabbed her by the arm, pulling her toward the living room. "We need to finish this," he whispered urgently. Now. They moved quickly, their hearts pounding in their ears. As they entered the living room, Emily saw her father standing by the fire, his back to them. He hadn't heard the gunshot, too distracted by his thoughts to notice what was happening behind him. David didn't hesitate. With a swift motion, he pulled the handgun from his coat and aimed at Robert's back. The shot echoed through the room, and her father collapsed in an instant, his body crumpling like a rag doll. Emily stared at him, her mind numb. It was over. Her parents were gone. But the nightmare was far from over. David turned to Emily, his face a mask of cold determination. "We need to clean up," he said, his voice flat. "We don't want anyone to know what we've done." Together, they moved through the house, erasing every trace of their presence. They knew the next part of the plan would be even more difficult. Emily's brother, Ben, and his wife, Erica, were due to arrive soon, along with their 2 young children. But what would happen when they walked into this home, this scene of unimaginable horror? Emily wasn't sure, but she knew that nothing could ever be the same again. As the minutes ticked by, Emily felt a numbness settle over her. The guilt, the terror, the confusion, all of it would come later. For now, they had done what they came to do, and there was no going back. The dark, twisted plan she and David had crafted together was unfolding exactly as they had intended. But as they stood in the quiet house, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they had just crossed a line from which there would be no return. The doorbell rang, snapping Emily back to reality. She looked at David, her heart pounding in her chest. This was it. The next chapter of their nightmare was about to begin. The encounter with the past expanded. The doorbell's shrill sound pierced the silence like a knife, cutting through the thick air that hung in the aftermath of the carnage. For a moment, Emily stood frozen in the center of the living room, the weight of the gun in her hand reminding her of the irreversible steps she had taken. The blood of her parents was still fresh on the floor, their bodies mere feet away from where she now stood, waiting for the next wave of destruction to arrive. David, equally calm but now alert, glanced at her and then toward the door. There was no panic in his eyes, no second thoughts, only a cold resolve. He was far beyond the point of hesitation, but Emily's heart hammered in her chest. The next part of their plan, killing her brother and his family, was a step she hadn't fully prepared for. She had killed her parents, yes, but to kill innocent children, her own niece and nephew, was an entirely different matter. The guilt and fear that had been buried under layers of anger and resentment were rising to the surface, threatening to drown her. "Don't stop now," David whispered, his voice low but intense. "We have to finish this. It's the only way to be free." The words, though cold, felt like a command, one that Emily could no longer ignore. They had already come this far. There was no turning back. Taking a steadying breath, Emily stepped toward the door, her legs feeling heavy beneath her. She could hear David moving behind her, his presence a constant reminder of the twisted bond that had led them here. The weight of what she had already done pressed down on her, but she didn't allow herself to think about it. She couldn't. Not yet. As she opened the door, the fresh winter air hit her face, a sharp contrast to the suffocating atmosphere inside the house. Standing before her was her brother Ben, with his wife Erica and their two young children, Olivia and Nathan. They were bundled up in coats and scarves, the excited chatter of the children barely audible over the sound of the wind. It was all so normal, so innocent, and yet in that moment, Emily felt a rush of nausea. Ben, always the golden child in the Turner family, smiled as he saw his sister. "Hey, Em, Merry Christmas," he called cheerfully, unaware of the nightmare waiting for him behind the door. Emily felt a sudden wave of rage toward him. Ben had always been the favored one, the one who could do no wrong, the one who had never had to endure the kind of disappointment that Emily had suffered her entire life. And now, standing before him, she realized that this was the man who had failed to recognize the years of pain, of neglect, that had driven her to this point. The children, oblivious to the tension in the air, tugged at their parents' coats, eager to get inside and see their grandparents. They were too young to understand the significance of the evening, too young to realize that they were walking into the jaws of hell. Emily's mind was clouded with anger, confusion, and a sick sense of urgency. Everything she had lived through, every painful moment, every cutting remark from her parents, Ben's casual dismissal of her struggle, it all came rushing back. She barely heard David step up behind her, his hand brushing against her shoulder as he came to stand next to her, as if offering her silent support, or perhaps a reminder of the fate they had chosen. "You should come inside," Emily said, her voice betraying none of the turmoil inside her. She forced a smile, but it felt like a mask, one that was slipping the more she tried to hold it up. Ben raised an eyebrow at her. "You don't look so good," he remarked, his tone carrying a hint of concern, but also the unmistakable superiority of someone who had everything he needed in life. The comment stung, but Emily didn't react. She couldn't afford to. "No, it's nothing," Emily replied quickly, pushing the door open wider. "Just come on in. Mom and Dad are waiting." Ben exchanged a quick look with Erica, then shrugged. "All right, if you say so," he said, stepping inside with Olivia and Nathan following closely behind. They had no idea what was waiting for them. As they entered the living room, Emily could see that Ben immediately noticed the strange atmosphere. The house was too still, too quiet for a Christmas gathering. The lights on the tree twinkled brightly, but they did little to mask the sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. Her parents, Robert and Susan, were nowhere to be seen, which only added to the oddness of the scene. "Mom, Dad," Ben called out as he looked around, but there was no response. The only sound was the faint crackling of the fire in the hearth, the flames flickering in the dark. "They're probably in the kitchen," Emily said, her voice cool and even. "They were getting dinner ready when I last saw them." Ben, clearly not convinced, frowned and started walking toward the kitchen. The children, who had been tugging at his sleeve, were now distracted by the brightly wrapped presents under the tree. They had no idea of the nightmare unfolding around them. "Ben, don't," Emily said, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her heart thudded in her chest as her brother turned to look at her, a questioning expression on his face. But before he could say anything more, Emily felt David's hand press lightly against her back. She turned to look at him, her eyes meeting his for a brief moment, and she saw the cold determination in his face. This was it. The final act was about to play out. Without warning, David moved swiftly, his hand gripping the gun with deadly precision as he raised it. Ben, hearing the sudden movement, whipped around just in time to see David's cold, steely gaze. His eyes widened, a flash of realization cutting through the confusion. "You? What are you?" Ben's words were cut off by the sharp crack of the gunshot, the sound filling the room and sending a wave of shock through everyone in the house. Ben's body jerked back as the bullet tore into his chest, his arms flailing before he crumpled to the floor, the life draining from his face. The shock of it all hit Emily like a wave, but there was no time for hesitation. "Erica!" David barked, his voice rising as Erica screamed, her face turning white with horror. She stumbled backward, trying to shield the children, but her frantic movement was no match for David's speed. He was already moving toward her, the gun raised. "David, stop!" Emily shouted, her voice breaking as she finally found her voice. But it was too late. The second shot rang out, and Erica collapsed to the ground beside her husband, the blood pooling around her like a crimson halo. Emily's stomach lurched as she watched the carnage unfold, the brutality of it all washing over her. She had imagined this moment countless times, but now that it was real, it was more horrific than anything she could have anticipated. David turned toward the children, who had no idea what had just transpired. Olivia, her wide brown eyes filled with confusion, looked up at him as she clutched her stuffed bear. Nathan, barely old enough to understand, started to cry, his little body trembling with fear. "David, no!" Emily screamed, her voice filled with desperation. But David's face was unreadable as he approached the children. In his mind, there was no room for mercy. There was only the cold logic of their plan, the final steps that needed to be taken. And as he raised the gun, Emily could only stand there, paralyzed by the horror of it all, knowing that the nightmare she had started was about to reach its tragic and inevitable conclusion.